South Africa has been greylisted, a not altogether unexpected decision made by the Financial Action Task Force yesterday. It's been a hot topic of discussion in the 24 hours since, how it affects in the main our trading and transactional relationships with our international counterparts. South Africa has been taking mitigating actions to address concerns that were raised, and tonight we focus on some of the actions we still urgently need to take to turn this around. Let's talk now to Khaya Sithole, a leading economist and broadcaster, to share his thoughts on this development and what it will mean in terms of a swift turnaround for South Africa. Khaya, good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I want to just kind of assess your reaction to what happened yesterday against the backdrop of us needing to work harder on things like asset seizures and prosecution for money laundering. How have we done so far that gives us a sense of how we're going to do going forward?
Good afternoon to the viewers. The problem, of course, is that, when you look at the history of how we ended up here, there was an evaluation report that was conducted that then indicated to us as a country where our red flags were. And we were then given an opportunity to address those red flags ahead of a follow-up, a session where, of course, the question on whether we're going to get greylisted or not was going to be deliberated on. And unfortunately, what we then saw is that the process that South Africa undertook to address those particular deficiencies was really a process of lethargy, if we can describe it in no other terms. It was a process that didn't seem to capture the essence of the emergency and the sense of urgency that needed to be applied in order for us to be able to address these issues. So what we do know now is that in the initial report, obviously, there were many red flags that have been issued. There were many issues that have been raised. We've narrowed down some of them, but of course, those that we haven't resolved were still substantive enough for the plenary to say, look, we are going to put you on this particular list. Now, the concern, of course, is that if we are now saying, look, we need to be able to address these particular issues within a particular time frame, we're not sure whether the legislatures or the people that are responsible for writing our laws are going to understand the sense of urgency associated with this, or whether the processes will now be a bit smoother in order for us to be removed from the grey list in the shortest time frame possible. So the evidence in front of us indicates that the people that we've tasked with the responsibility of dealing with this don't seem to have the same sense of understanding of how critical and how urgent this problem is. So I do not have much faith in their ability to fix it in the short term.
Well, let's look at our performance on prosecutions. Let's look at the establishment of the investigating directorate in the NPA to go after those implicated in state capture. You're saying that plus the laws we're looking to enact, plus some of the holes that we're hoping to close in terms of what is expected of us, it doesn't look like we're going to make a big dent.
The most important thing about this particular process is that it's a process that doesn't get swayed by just optics. So one of the developments that you saw last year in particular is that towards the end of the year, there was then this process in Parliament where National Treasury was submitting a whole range of bills that needed to be adopted and to be approved. And then President Cyril Ramaphosa broke his own record in that he obviously signed them into law based on the sense of urgency that was there. But the issue here is that it is not sufficient to simply say we've changed the law or written a new regulation. You then have to test that particular regulation or that law against actual case studies so we know how effective it is. So in the South African case, it is not sufficient for us to simply say that in the NPA we've set up a new unit that does X, Y, and Z. We have to be able to say that after we set up that unit in the NPA that does X, Y, and Z, here are the 2 or 3 cases that were then taken to that particular unit, that those cases were then able to demonstrate that South Africa has got a much better understanding of how to deal with issues of cash flows happening within its borders. It's got much better ways of enforcing the laws that it is written, and it is a country that is now in a better position to say, look, where I can explain what is happening within our borders at any particular point in time. And until you've got those actual case studies, the laws are simply going to be a matter of anecdotal issues. We do not know how effective they are. We do not know whether perhaps the defenses that people are going to put up are going to be so strong, the laws are actually going to turn out to be moot and meaningless. And until you actually have the test cases, the laws are a good idea, but they have to be tested for effectiveness, and that what hasn't happened simply because of how late in the process we actually came up with the laws.
And added to that, I mean, there is a sobering link, Khaya. The implications are for, amongst a range of other things, less capital inflows into South Africa, leading to a balance of payment crisis. Given that our backs are already against the wall, we heard our debt to GDP stabilizing upwards of 72%. Our debt servicing is astronomical. Tell us plainly what we're facing on the economic front following this decision.
So the immediate consequences of that is that whoever you transact with on an international platform in particular is then expected to treat you with a greater sense of skepticism as a South African business or as a South African government, which simply means that while yesterday they may have been happy to engage with you in a particular transaction and decide that the cost of that transaction is 5% or 10%, after the grey listing process, they are not only expected to conduct additional due diligence processes, in other words, ask many more questions. The compliance process becomes a bit more costly, but also because you've essentially been regarded as a risky counterparty, it then gives them the opportunity to then say, look, yesterday, your risk profile was XYZ. Today, your risk profile is a bit different. So therefore, we think it makes sense for us to charge you a bit more to execute in this particular transaction. So you're going to start seeing that happening in relation to some of our state-owned enterprises, for example, and some of our local businesses that then have, international counterparts who then say, well, actually, based on your classification, we either are prohibited from dealing with you altogether, which happens in some cases, or in some instances, they'll simply say, look, we're still going to deal with you, but your risk profile demands that we do so a bit differently.
So that's on the macro front. Very quickly, I have little time left. I've been asked a lot of questions about the implications for things like, when South Africans go traveling abroad, how will their transactions be affected in the short and medium term, if at all?
Look, we're on the monitoring list. So the grey list is not the worst. There is a process that can make it worse where somebody says, look, don't deal with those people. Every single rand that you see in the system is a rand that has been stolen. So for now, I don't think you and I traveling across the globe is going to be something that suddenly changes materially. People are still going to be able to accept the type of credit cards that we have, particularly because most of the credit cards that we use, for example, are already endorsed by international partners, whether it's Visa or MasterCard. So in the short term, I wouldn't say people must change their travel plans, but I think obviously in the long run there are the knock-on effects. So if you look at how the exchange rate might react to this, for example, many more counterparties will say, look, we actually do not want to be dealing with South African companies or the South African government at all, which has implications for the strength of our currency. So even though you and I may still be able to use our credit cards on the international merchants tomorrow, it may turn out to be a bit more expensive on the basis that actually there are some consequences associated with being grey listed.
Khaya Sithole, as always, we appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much for talking to us. Economist Khaya Sithole there.